We have been talking about research and data and how the way we collect data influences the conclusions that we can make in our research studies. Specifically, we've been talking recently about the sample. A sample is a subset of the accessible population. In the last video, I talked about types of samples, how a type of sample is determined by the method we use to do sampling, and how the type of sample can in fact influence our research outcomes, because when we use an convenience sample, the convenience sample is not going to be representative of our accessible population. Even worse would be a voluntary response sample in which individuals self-select for our study. So better sampling methods are simple random sample, because randomness allows everyone an equal chance to be selected, and because of that, typically yields a sample that is representative of the accessible population in regards to relevant variables, that is, variables related to what we are studying. And then stratified random sampling can help us make sure that if there is an important reason to stratify, that is, if we think, for instance, we may have different results from freshmen than we would from sophomores, and sophomores from juniors, and juniors, seniors, and so forth, if we think that what we're studying might be related to class standing, then we want to make sure we have a good representation of each of those groups in our samples so we can stratify before doing random sampling. We're going to continue now with this topic, talking now about the sampling frame. The sampling frame is simply a list of members of the accessible population. So in the example in which I'm going to do research with university undergraduate students at the University of South Carolina, if I obtain a list of students from the university registrar, that list is the sampling frame. It's not needed for non-random samples such as convenience samples, because we're not selecting from anything. We're taking what's convenient. Not needed for voluntary response samples. But when random processes are used to select a sample, we have to have a list to select from. We can't say that everyone has an equal chance of being selected for our sample if, in fact, we don't have a list that we're sampling from. So the sampling frame is simply this list. Now let's talk about different types of bias. Bias, as you might suspect, is a bad thing in research. It means that the data collected will systematically favor certain outcomes. We don't want that as researchers. What we want is to find out what actually exists, not to try to bias the results of our study. So let's talk about different ways that bias can occur with our samples. Sampling bias means the sample is obtained in such a way that not every member of the population has an equal chance of selection, and therefore we can end up with bias because we don't have good representation of the accessible population. And we ultimately want to answer questions for the target population. This is not a good place to start. Convenience and voluntary response samples both suffer from sampling bias. If I want to research, for example, methods and strategies students use when they study, using you students in my class and finding out how you study is not necessarily going to be reflective of, say, how someone in the mathematics department studies or how someone in the history department studies. So using you in my study as part of a convenience sample will end up not giving me results that can generalize, but will bias the results in favor of the individuals who are represented by the people in this class. And who's represented by the people in this class? People who are going to take an introductory statistics course in behavioral and social science. So you might be representative of those people, but not of university students or students as a whole. The next type of bias is undercoverage. Undercoverage creates sampling bias because a group is left out of the sample or is underrepresented in the sample. This can even occur with random sampling methods due to an incomplete sampling frame. For instance, the homeless are often left out of surveys and even out of the United States Census, which is designed to count everyone in the United States. Undercoverage is certainly going to be a problem with a voluntary response sample because there are certain types of people that are never going to voluntarily reply when they're asked to answer a survey that they don't have to answer. So when a group is left out of the sample or is underrepresented in the sample, this can create undercoverage. If I were to use a convenient sample of graduate students, but my target is all university students, I'm certainly going to have undercoverage. Non-response is when a member of the sample cannot be contacted or refuses to participate. And if I end up not being able to contact a certain type of individual, or a certain type of individual refuses to participate, then in fact I can have systematic bias because of the non-response of those types of individuals. An example would be if I was studying drug use on a college campus, and so I ask individuals questions about their drug use, and individuals who are users don't even respond, I will come away with biased results. There's another possibility for my example about surveying people about their drug use, and that is individuals change their response because they don't want to tell me the honest answer about drug use, or they want to make themselves look better in terms of what they perceive as is acceptable societal norms regarding drug use. And this is response bias. Response bias occurs when some respondents adjust their response based on what they think will make them sound good or what they think someone might want to hear. That's response bias. Wording effects can influence how individuals respond and therefore bias a study. Consider these examples. In recent surveys, only 13% of Americans think that we are spending too much on, quote, assistance to the poor, but 44% think we are spending too much on welfare. You see what happens here? The effect of the wording, the use of the term welfare, that's considered negative by some people who don't think about what that term actually means, that it means that individuals are being helped. And so there's a segment of the society that would respond that we're spending too much on that. Yet if you ask those same exact people the question in a different way about assistance to the poor, where it becomes more of a charitable and helping out, then suddenly we get a different response rate. The way items are worded can influence responses and bias outcomes. So all of this has to do with samples. The type of sample is reliant on the way we sample. Sampling frame is where we can randomly select individuals from. It's basically a list of our accessible population. And then we talked about types of bias and how that can influence our research results.